So hey guys, I just wanted to quickly get this video out. I'm speeding up the entire painting process, and I'm going to be talking over, giving commentary. This first part, I'm just trying to get the highlights and lowlights of the blade. One of the things that will make metal look more like metal is if you have a lot of contrast between the highlights and the lowlights. And so here on the cut part of the blade, I'm putting nearly white reflections and then also much darker sort of environmental reflections on there. It's sort of the reflection of what you would see in the environment. I was trying out a solution for softening the transition from blade to sword, but I didn't like it, so I got rid of it. Now I'm putting on sharper highlights on all those places that would pick up highlights or lowlights, just so I can show that there's like a little bevel between those two transitions, and that's going to be a better solution for making it look a little bit more believable. Here I'm adding a bunch of contrast. I decided that I needed a darker space on that blade to make it look more dynamic. I've got the reference up in the background to make sure I keep myself on track. And now here are the little sharp highlights that would show a small bevel on that transition shape. And I go around and do this all over the blade in different positions and try to get it looking nice. I did mess with messing up that bevel a little bit to make it choppier, to show little imperfections, but I didn't really like it, so I reverted back. You'll see me frequently pull out like this, where I'm checking overall what I did, and then I'll zoom back in and work. Make sure that as you guys work, you do that. Zoom into work nice and big so you're using the maximum screen real estate, and then go back out again and take a look at what you did. So here I'm adding it over the flat parts of the blade so that it looks a little bit more reflective. I'm using pretty large choppy brushes so that I still have a brushy kind of appearance to the work that I'm doing, which I find is a lot more forgiving than using perfect digital tools. Now I've moved on to softening the shadows that I did in the last part of the video. Any part of this object that is slowly changing from highlight side to shadow side, I want to soften that shadow. There are a lot of places where the shadow is going to be sharper, like where an object just ends and there's nothing behind it, or where you might have a cast shadow from something being cast on another object behind it. But every place that I think that there is definitely a surface change happening slowly, I'm coming in and just blurring that shadow out. So you see it on the eyeballs, on the beak, on the forehead, on the cheek. Some of them need a much larger blur if there's a softer space, and some of them don't. Good example here on the grip is where all of those shadows that are going across the barrel shape of the grip are soft now, and all of the shadows that are right near that terminating edge are sharper. Now I'm going back to the base layer and messing with the patina and surface colors of the object. You can see when I turn off the shadows how flat they are. This is so that I can get that metallic kind of grain appearance, and I decided to put in a little bit of corrosion here and there, although I don't think it shows up in the final. I'm referring to those background pictures in my reference layer, and so I moved that one a lot closer so I could sample colors. I wasn't happy working over this a lot of the time because my base color was too light, and as I work over and over it, it got darker and darker and darker, which is something that was confusing me, but I realized I hadn't done a highlights pass, and so that's why everything looks so dark. So in just a little bit here, I'm going to add highlights, but for now, it does look rather dark. It has a lot of grain and texture to it, and so I worked over that. Here I'm changing focus to working on the grip. You can see that originally when I painted those shadow layers, they were all just complete opacity. But as I work, I'm turning those shadow layers to multiply and then lowering their opacity so that anything I do with the surface patina can show through. Here I'm starting to add highlights onto the face, so any part that would face directly towards my light source, I want to put a little spot of specular light. You want to make this more focused, the more chrome and reflective, like a mirror your object is. You want to make this more matte and diffuse if your object is like rubber or wood or something. This particular metal is somewhere in between where there is going to be a nice shiny highlight, but it's not going to be so distinct as to be a mirror, and so I'm leaving it pretty rough. This part here, where a bunch of dimension was just added in that head, was going back to my shadow layer and erasing out very softly little bits of the shadow so that it has a bit more dimension to it. So the shadow is not just one color applied over the entire thing. I actually did this with a transparency mask so that I could go back and forth painting black and white. So if I remove the shadow a little bit, then it lightens back up a bit. You can see on the back of the head there that there's little bits that are a bit lighter now. I also end up doing this on the grip. In just a second, you'll see on the back ridge of the shadow, I'll go back in and erase out some of that shadow so that there's a little bit of environmental reflection. Here I'm trying to mess with the texture of the grip. This was probably the least successful part of my particular project because I needed to do a little bit more work and zoom in, make sure I understood everything. There you go. So the shadow on the back of the grip is now lightened up. But it helps. As long as there's some texture there and it's not nothing, it's going to be a bit better. So here I'm zooming way out, taking a look at it, deciding that I needed a little bit of glow and specular highlights on different places. This is done with just a airbrush, very soft brush, and then turning the opacity down and turning it to either overlay or screen. Here I'm adding a little bit of a background presentation to it, and I mess around with creating a highlight on the sword, an outline on the sword that separates it from this as well, and then I think I ultimately just turned that off. So I just traced that in, lock its pixels, and then paint with gray, and then I decided I didn't like it. In the next couple of sections here, I'm going to do specialty things that you might need to do in your weapon. So in this case, I'm adding damage to it. Little notches that I'm erasing away from the primary object. We're using a transparency mask. And then adding little edge shadows and edge highlights to make it look more legitimate. I do some surface scratches on the ridge up here. Same sort of thing. Draw your shape, lock your pixels, draw a highlight edge and a low light edge. And then I actually go as far as to make a giant crack in the blade as well. So I know that a few of you have damage like that, and so here I'm shaping out this elaborate crack, locking the pixels, drawing my highlight edge and my low light edge, and then I go so far as to remove a chunk of the blade. Right here I had to turn the background back on to show, and then adding a highlight edge to that as well. So it looks like a piece is almost falling out of this blade surface. This last bit, I'm adding a glowing jewel to the eye of the head so that you can see what that's going to look like if you need to do something magical or special effects. Probably want to get reference of a jewel or something, but I just did it by hand. And now this is an overlay with just a glowing red and then an overlay with some shiny white highlights, adding a little bit more detail to the gem. And there we go. We've got a nice glowing gem. So overall, that's the process of making this weapon. You need to do all of your research and get your nice drawing, shape it out properly, make sure that you break it down into each shape so that you can paint them separately and work more freely and noodle them and going back and forth. And working in this method is very convenient because you don't have to tackle everything at once, which can be very overwhelming. And it allows you to maybe detail the blade without worrying about messing up the handle, or work on the handle and completely change your mind and swap it out for a different piece later on if that's something that you want to do. So once we got to the painting process, it was flat color, then primary shadows. Then I moved on to adding highlights, basic highlights all over the thing. Then messing with the surface patina and texture, which you can go back to your flat colors for that. And then finally just adding little bits of polish here and there. So surface texture where necessary, small targeted highlights where necessary, glowing bits if possible, and then little surface scratches, dings, indentations. You could even add stains if you want to, that sort of thing. So I hope that was helpful, you guys, and be sure to ask questions if you need them.